Hey Dave, I was watching a Critical Drinker video where he said he would stop reviewing Picard because it was terrible, cynical, and untrue to the original vision. Do you think this was inevitable because of the failure of Imagine liberalism in the original series and TNG failing to deliver on all those promises? Well, I mean, this is interesting. So Picard is obviously the latest iteration of um, it's the latest iteration of Star Trek. I guess that was obvious, but I feel like I need to clarify it for non-Trekkies. So there was a certain number of iterations. So Star Trek was the brainchild of someone named Gene Roddenberry, who was this classic young 60ish idealist. And his his idea was there was going to be this post-secular utopia of exploration, and you can see these evolutions in the 60s when it comes on. It's basically, Captain Picard is a cowboy, but one who's more racially tolerant, who's taken on board sort of libertarian attitudes of the 1960s, and of course, being a 60s guy, he's got a new side chick every episode. And but he's a wild cannon, right? Very very liberated, and the Federation is this bold, pioneering, spacefaring step forward into the future. By the 80s, it's moderated and it's become it's still very exploratory, but it's distinctly sort of a very UN organization. It's more bureaucratic. The Captain Picard is a thinker. He's not very much. He's not a cowboy. He's this French Englishman, Jean-Luc Picard, and everything he wants to do is negotiate. He doesn't want to ever blast the aliens. He wants to study their culture from afar. And so this was sort of an evolution. It was a more idealistic evolution of Gene Roddenberry. And then just before Gene Roddenberry died, and I don't know if this was really in keeping with his vision, the last iteration of Star Trek came in, which is Deep Space Nine, which is, I think, the last good Star Trek, most people think. And this was sort of like Game of Thrones meets Star Trek. It turns out that the Federation is not actually this idealist organization. The reason why it's so idealist is that it's just richer than all of its temporal opponents. It's sort of like the United States and the Soviet Union. It doesn't have to really worry about the Klingons or the Romulans, because the Klingons and the Romulans aren't a real threat to the Federation. The Klingons and the Romulans have to spend all of their money in military just to compete with the Federation. And what happens in Deep Space Nine is the Federation comes in conflict with a villain it's still political. It's not like the Borg, which is just sort of this force of nature. But it comes in conflict with a political entity that is like it, but evil and way richer and way bigger. And what you see is the Federation sort of pulling out the stops. The hard political realities become real again, and it has to make decisions between principle and winning the war. And so, like, this is sort of it subverts the genre slightly. The problem with this new stuff is that Deep Space Nine was how we can obviously the original series was, this is liberalism, it's just freedom and exploration. The 80s, 90s Next Generation was, we're the UN, we're the responsible ones, we're principled. Deep Space Nine was, let's test those principles. In the latest Star Trek, the problem is just it's basically just self-congratulatory bullshit. The problem is not that it's a worldview in crisis. It's a worldview that does not want to acknowledge how it's in crisis. What the story they want to tell is everything about the Next Generation worldview was going great, and then bad actors, like evil people, destroyed it all. And so we need to find the bad people and get the good people to come in and fix everything. So it's not like Deep Space Nine, where the Federation has to wrestle with its own internal contradictions. The fact that its idealism is built on a phony premise of always being richer than their enemies. This is the next generation, or sorry, the new Star Treks like Discovery and Picard, all it is just them. It's basically more and more what it's become is progressives having struggle sessions and cathartic therapy sessions in their entertainment. They want to say that this is, we're the good guys and everything else, everyone who's forcing us to violate our principles is evil. This is another one of the reasons, there was this moment in the dialogue with Sitch that kind of demonstrated this, where Sitch said, he asked me about a shit take I had about Ukraine, and I essentially gave him the line that, well, the best take you can have about Ukraine is Putin has no agency. And Sitch said, well, no, Putin absolutely has agency. And this is such a fundamental disconnect, right? Like, okay, so so let's say that you're in Deep Space Nine and you're faced with the Dominion, and they're bad dudes and are cutting in on your territory. Discovery and Picard, they just want to call them bad. What they would say is, well, the Dominion has agency, doesn't it? It has agency, therefore they're bad, and then we'll just magically win because we're the Mary Sues of our own universe. That's the wrong lesson. The lesson of the Dominion is, this is what the Dominion does, and you're either going to deal with this reality of this is how the Dominion operates, or you're going to be buried by that reality, and you're going to get a lot more people killed than need to be killed. And that's the sort of step that Star Trek refuses to take. Game of Thrones worked right up into the point where they discarded cynical politics. The point where Daenerys Targaryen becomes Medea and burns the city, that was actually, spoiler alert, that was actually like the best part of a very, very, very bad set of last seasons. The problem, the sort of quintessential bad moment of Star Trek, I only know this because it was repeated on Telegram, was when Stacey Abrams appears as the president of Earth, and she meets the black captain of the new Enterprise, or whatever the flagship thing is, and they just sit staring at each other, gloating, patting each other on the back about how good they are, how noble it is to be part of the Federation. Man, we're just so good for being us. And it's just so funny because that's there's no tension, there's no catharsis, there's something learned. It's just a moment where the cameo Stacey Abrams, who again is a horrible politician in my opinion, for the disastrous fiasco she engineered in the Middle East in the Arab Spring, and she's just gloating about how good her character is next to another character who's patting herself on the back for being a good character, and this is the kind of asinine rabbit hole you get down when you start talking about how Putin has agency. I mean, it's bullshit. He does what he does, and we react to it. We either fight over Ukraine, or we try to come to terms with his military supremacy and sign a peace treaty that does not create a global food crisis, which is the only responsible thing to do.